Sephardic World. We bring you weekly meetings about Sephardic history and genealogy. We are forever grateful to our patrons who provide the money for us to be able to do this thing. And if you want to become a patron, just follow the link in the email you got and donate. Today we have with us Professor Julia Creet. She is a professor of English at York University in Toronto, and she is a critic of the genealogy industry. What happens to your data once you put them in the forums provided by various genealogical companies? What do they do with these data except providing them to you and others? Is there a downside to the industry? And I welcome Julia Creet, and I ask her to just begin.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, David, for inviting me to your meeting. Welcome to all of you. I'm delighted to see you here. Well, let me just, rephrase my introduction a little bit. Yes, I'm a critic of the industry, but I spent, the better part of a decade deep in the archives of family history. So I have a very good sense of the investments. And have I lost? Ton, have I cut out?
We can hear you fine.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, yes. Sorry. My internet is famously unstable. So I'll just keep talking and hopefully I will return visually.
We will warn you in chat if you are cut
although the
off
chat will disappear as well. But it usually reloads within a minute. Mm-hmm. So I do have as I said, I spent a decade in the between about 1990 and the early 2000s, investigating my own family history, Ashkenazi, Eastern Europe, a Holocaust history that was completely disavowed by my mother. So trying to come to terms with those questions of the need to know, secrecy, the appeal of the archives, the appeal of the detective work, just all of the complexity of the emotional investments in genealogy, and particularly Jewish genealogy, where there's been so many disruptions to inheritance of all kinds, to the inheritance of culture, to the inheritance of records, to cultural inheritance. So I understand these motivations deeply and personally. And in no way would I say to anyone, look, just don't do it. That's not, that's not the message I bring. But I did, as I was doing my own research and towards the end of my research, and if you're interested in that, if you go to my website, you'll see there's 2 documentaries. The second documentary is Data Mining the Deceased, but the first documentary is called Mum, a story about silence. And you'll forgive me the play on words. It's a bad pun, but it worked in that case. And that documentary was about my own search. As I came to the end of that process, I was working in Hungary. I saw many Jewish genealogists in particular who were going into graveyards, photographing gravestones, sending those photographs back to the States in particular, to Jewish Gen and other databases. And I began to wonder about, how much my motivations were just mine, or was I part of a zeitgeist? Was I part of a really growing movement of genealogists and interest in genealogy? And we all know that it absolutely took off between, it built momentum after Alex Haley's 1976 Roots. This is any good historian of any genealogist, of genealogy will tell you that that's really, in North America, that Alex Haley's Roots was one of the books, movies that really stirred strong interest in genealogy. But then it really started to gather steam when the databases came online. And particularly, again, for North American genealogy, and that's where my expertise is, in terms of the industry itself. So the technology allowed people, and I'm sure that you are all familiar with this, the technology allowed people to do research that would have been impossible to do before. It allowed people access to archival records. It aggregated information. It made, it possible to make all of these family connections. Now, I'm sure many of you have done original archival research, and that's one of the great joys, I think, of genealogical research. But now it's virtually impossible to do. Of course, the archives are all closed. And moreover, a lot of archives have cut deals. Almost every archive in the municipal archive in the world, most religious archives, have cut deals with Ancestry and the Mormons to digitize that information in exchange for their, for having copies of those digital records themselves, or the copies of, essentially for preservation and access. So very few people actually go to archives anymore, and as I say, it's been impossible for the last year. I was lucky in a sense that I was able to spend the better part of a year and a half in Hungary in all kinds of archives, in religious archives, in municipal archives, in military archives, in business archives. I love archival research. And I imagine that many of you do too. And that's part of the absolute allure of what you do, and making connections, and it's a fascinating endeavor. But along with the digital, sorry, somebody's just, there we go. Okay, thanks. Along with the arrival of the digitized records came the involvement of companies who were aggregating the data for purposes other than genealogy. And so that's what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about today. Both the zeitgeist itself, our motivations for doing this research, and also the motivations of the companies that are now collecting that data, and why they're collecting it and what they want to do with it. And those two sets of motivations are not very closely linked anymore. They were in the beginning, but increasingly, the companies that run the databases have no interest in genealogy, really. They are enticing people like me and you to give our information to them for other purposes. Now, this may not come as news to many of you, and it may not concern you either, and that's totally fine. But I think it's, as researchers, as scholars, everybody who does this work is a kind of historian, and I think as scholars, it's incumbent on us in some ways to think about the context of our own work. in what are the motivations that act on us. So my process of trying to work through that question after I had finished my own documentary and I had come up with a serviceable narrative. And that's what most of us want. We want a story that we can tell, a story that makes sense, a story that makes us feel connected, stories that make us interesting. Those narrative motivations are very powerful and important. We are stories. Corey Meyerink, who was one of the first professional genealogists that I interviewed in Salt Lake City, because obviously the first place I went when I started to do my research was Salt Lake City. And he had started this company called Pro Genealogists in I think the mid 1980s. And one of the first things he said to me was, we are stories. We have been stories since our ancestors started writing on cave walls. So this is a very old impulse. What's new about it is the technological access that we have to the records that allow us to aggregate and tell those stories differently. So the question I posed to myself was, what's the relationship between technology and narrative when it comes to genealogy? How do those two things go together? If telling stories about ourselves and our ancestors and our family connections is one of the things that makes us human, really, how has technology changed that? So that was the question I posed to myself. And when I started to make Data Mining the Deceased, which I know a few of you have seen and is available through my website, it's available on Amazon Prime in a bunch of countries, Curiosity Stream. It's streaming in a lot of places around the world. When I started to make the documentary, I got my crew together and I said, okay, I want to make a documentary about databases. They looked at me and they said, databases? There's no story in databases. Why would you do that? That's like, there's nothing there. And I said, well, no, I think there is something there. But they went along with me because they were my friends, but they really questioned why on earth anybody would want to make a documentary about databases. It turns out that maybe I was about 5 years too early. That in some ways, if I had made that documentary now, and I'm thinking of making a second documentary just on genetic genealogy, I think more people would have understood in some ways why it's important to think about databases. So I went to, for those of you who've seen the doc, you'll know this already. I went to Salt Lake City because the Mormons have the most extensive database anywhere in the world of genealogical records, and they are intent on collecting all of the genealogical records of the world. I went to Iceland because Iceland has the most complete genealogical record of any nation, in part because their paper records are astounding. They start with the 9th century sagas. Iceland is a genealogical treasure, really. So they have the most complete genealogical records of the world, and now they have the most complete genetic record of the world as well. I came to England. I interviewed a bunch of people in England. And where else did I go? I can't even remember where else I went. But when I was in Salt Lake City, I interviewed both the executive branch of the Mormon Church, the executives who run Family Search, the genealogical database, and I interviewed the founders of Ancestry.com. And those were absolutely fascinating interviews. And out of those interviews came a kind of bald statement by one of the founders of Ancestry that the Mormons were essentially the motivators of the entire industry. That without the Mormon Church, we would not have the kind of intense interest in genealogy that we do internationally. And I mean, that was a pretty radical statement to make. Now, the founders of Ancestry.com were two Mormon graduate students, and they were both graduate students at Brigham Young University when they bought a company, publishing company called Ancestry.com, because they recognized that they could put some of that information, they could digitize books, they could put some of the information that Ancestry had already online. Well, actually, they weren't putting it online, they were putting it on floppy disks, and they were selling those disks. So this is pre-internet, really. So they started selling those disks, but just to Mormons. That was their original consumer group. And they were floored when it took off, absolutely floored. And they realized that they had tapped into a huge industry, a potential industry. Now, shortly after that, online databases, the internet started to take off. Online databases were the next thing. And they realized that if they shifted from floppy disks to online databases, they could broaden their reach tremendously. So that's what they did. And they made a commitment, which you still see now today in Ancestry, to keep adding databases, right? So there's a continual feed of databases. And that business philosophy proved to be enormously successful, because genealogy, for most genealogists, it's not something sometimes you pick it up and you stop it, and you pick it up and you stop it. But for a lot of people, I think the impulse is just to keep going and more information. There's never really an end to it. And so they recognize that the impulse is just to keep aggregating more and more information, making your family trees, more and more connected. That's kind of the thrill of it. There is no end to it. So they capitalized on an idea that I then started to think about more deeply. So I've written a number of things, and I'll go back to the story of the Mormons and Ancestry in a minute. But I want to give you a little bit of a theoretical frame, I guess, for how I understand the motivations and where the motivations and the industry intersect. When I was doing my own search, I thought, okay, well, where does this end? Like, when will I have enough information? And at a certain point, I think about maybe only 2 or 3 generations back, I thought, well, this ends in a shtetl in Eastern Europe. And how much does my life resemble anything that would have happened in that shtetl? And I thought, yeah, there's not much resemblance. There's actually no resemblance at all. And I thought, okay, well, so that's enough. I have enough information. But there's another impulse, and it's the impulse that you see in the databases themselves, and it's part of what motivates us to keep going. And it's this idea of, and forgive me for using this word, but of a sublime feeling. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about our own processes, our ideas that we just want to keep building more and more, the databases, every database wants to accumulate more and more records. The Mormons want all of the genealogical records in the world. Genetic genealogy promises us relations, promises us that we could discover our 800 cousins. Those are numbers that actually, they don't make much sense in and of themselves. We don't need that much information to know who we are. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. The more information we gather, the less important we become. Okay, that sounds like a contradiction or a paradox, and it is. So the idea of the sublime is that, and there's Immanuel Kant, again, forgive me, but it's an important idea. He hypothesized that there was a thing called the mathematical sublime, and that we were drawn to these ever bigger numbers. Infinity is a number that's I mean, it's not a number, but it's a sublime idea. It's bigger than we can imagine. And that's true of these databases, and it's true of genetic genealogy as well. We are making more connections. The potential is there to make more connections than we could ever actually meet, people that we could ever actually consider family. So there's a motivation that moves beyond our desire to know who we are. We are knowing who we are in ways that we've never been able to before, because of these databases, because of genetic genealogy. So the technology is changing who we think we are and who we think we're connected to. And it's changing it in mathematical ways, in technological ways, in what I would call sublime ways. So there's a sense of awe, and this is normally how we understand this idea. There's a sense of awe of being connected to this many people. And I've heard many genealogists say that. Many people I interviewed, I asked, so why do you do it? What is it? What is it that motivates you? And lots of people said, I'm not sure I can really tell you, but I have this sense of being, like a sense of awe, just of being connected to all of these people. So a sense of awe, but with that comes it's a bit disorienting. And so what we tend to do is to bring all of that information back into our narratives about who we are. So this idea is that the technology has allowed us to reach, to connect with more and more and more and more people. But the narrative techniques are ones that we use in some ways to defend ourselves against the idea of getting lost in those ever growing family trees. And we can talk about this after, about whether or not that's something that you've thought about or ever experienced. But the technologies, the databases, they encourage that feeling of wanting to gather more and more and more relatives, and wanting to make the trees go back further, because they recognize that is it's an easy way to motivate people. So what do they get out of it? And when I say they, who am I talking about? I'm talking about Ancestry.com. I'm talking about Family Search, the Mormon database. I'm talking about MyHeritage. I'm talking about GEDCOM, which is an interesting case, and I'll talk more about GEDCOM. Those are the big ones. Again, primarily North American and Israel. They know that if they can motivate us to continue to look, continue to kind of indulge in that sublime feeling of, oh, there's so many connections, and all of those connections feed sort of who I am, or my narrative about who I am, they know that we will continue to give them information. And we all know from Facebook, from all of the social media sites that we interact with, that information, personal information, is it's the new gold rush. But genealogy, genealogy depends on those connections. So there's an inverse relationship between genealogy. I mean, we want all those connections. We want to give away our information, and we want to get information, because without doing that, you can't make those connections. So there's an inverse relationship between genealogy and privacy, or genealogy and data ownership. So we give up information in order to get information. And I think for many people, that's a fine bargain. You know, there's nothing to worry about. There's nothing to be concerned about in that bargain. But as I investigated the industry further, I began to really wonder about the industry stakeholders and how they were using that information. So let me start with the Mormons, and I'm sure that many of you know a fair bit about the Mormon project, but I'll just give you a quick gloss. So the Mormons started collecting genealogical data in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century. Why did they start doing that? Because Joseph Smith, and there are various stories about why Joseph Smith invented this doctrine of posthumous baptism. Some people say, well, it's because his father had died, because he'd lost a couple of children. He was in the process of inventing Mormonism, or he was having these divine revelations, depending on how you look at it. And he was concerned that his own family members weren't going to live to see the day of, see the efflorescence of his own religion. So he invented a doctrine of posthumous baptism. And he said, we can baptize people into the Mormon religion after they are dead. But in order to do that, we have to know that they lived. We have to know that this was a person. So they start collecting genealogical records for the purpose of baptizing relatives after their death. That is, people who have not heard have not heard the Mormon message. That becomes the largest genealogical project in the world. Now, that may or may not concern us. That, I mean, there've been lots of controversies about the Mormon Church. The Catholic Church has stopped giving the Mormon Church records. The Protestant Church in Canada tried to prevent the Mormon Church from taking church records. There have been various groups that have tried to resist the Mormon effort, but it's a worldwide effort and is virtually impossible. Also, of course, the Mormons have the largest cache of Jewish genealogical records in the world, and in part because databases like Jewish Gen couldn't afford to keep the database running, and so they cut a deal. Well, actually, they cut a deal with Ancestry. But I'll talk a bit more about the relationship between the Mormon Church and Ancestry. But smaller databases couldn't afford to keep the upkeep of the databases, and so they cut deals with both the Mormons and Ancestry. So what the Mormons have done is they used their extensive databases to cut deals then with the commercial companies, both with government organizations worldwide and with the commercial companies. And of course, there have been controversies about, zealous Mormons who started baptizing Holocaust victims. And you might remember those controversies from the late 1990s, early 2000s. So there have been various attempts to contain the Mormon project. But it's essentially the Mormon databases that have driven the industry. What matters to the Mormons as much as the records are the family trees. So what they started doing was that some of the deals they started cutting with various companies were to say, okay, we'll give you a piece of our database, a section of our database for free, if you give us the family trees that your users have uploaded to your site. Because we need those family trees in order to prove ancestral relationships, in order to baptize everyone. Their project is to baptize everyone who has ever lived into the Mormon faith. So that's the Mormon agenda. Now, you might want to think about whether you want to be baptized posthumously. Some people are like, what does it matter? It's all fantasy. Some people are like, no, wait a minute. I'm Jewish. I don't want to be baptized Mormon after I've died. No, that idea doesn't appeal to me. But if you've uploaded a family tree to a commercial site, more than likely it's going to end up in the Mormon database. What's the relationship between the Mormon databases and Ancestry? Well, as I said, Ancestry was started by Mormon entrepreneurs. And I see there's a good discussion happening the individual must be a relative. Well, relative, as you know, is a relative word. So let's just, let's pause on that. That's how the Mormons got around that controversy, by saying, well, we have to prove, there has to be a proof of relationship. But that's what everyone's doing, right? I mean, you are proving relationships with second, third, fourth, fifth cousins. At a certain point, it's very easy to prove relationships. So that's not stopping their project by any means. That's why your family trees, when they go into the Mormon database, help them to expand that notion of what counts as a relative, or what counts as an ancestor. So what's the relationship between the Mormon Church and Ancestry? Well, Ancestry is a for-profit company. It's private, owned by private equity. It's not owned by the Mormon Church. In fact, it was just sold to Blackstone Industries, which is one of the biggest equity firms in the world. 75% of Ancestry was sold to Blackstone in I think February 2020. So they're separate entities, but their offices are a kilometer apart in Salt Lake City. Ancestry would not survive, would not have been as successful as it is without the Mormon Church. Once again, they started, Paul Allen and Dan Taggart started their database with the help of the Mormon Church. They had access to the Mormon databases. Then there was a whole kerfuffle about whether Ancestry subscribers could use the Mormon databases, and then there was a falling out. There was a marriage separation, but now they work hand in hand. And again, Ancestry feeds information to the Mormons. The Family Search feeds information to Ancestry. They have a synergistic relationship. As Shipley Munson said to me, and he was the CEO of he wasn't the CEO, he was I forget what his executive position was, but he was in the executive of Family Search. He said, we are interested, the Mormon Church is interested in motivating as many people as possible to get involved in genealogy. So Ancestry, so we're invested in the success of all of these companies because we're trying to build a community. Well, they're trying to build a community so they can carry out their religious doctrine. So there's a very tight relationship, obviously, between the Mormon Church, which is the biggest nonprofit database, and Ancestry, which has the biggest database, and now has the biggest genetic database as well, the biggest privately held genetic database in the world. So it's that that relationship, as I said, is a very, very tight relationship. But the Mormon Church has those relationships with 23andMe. It has those relationships with MyHeritage. It has those relationships with every major company. So even if you think that the company that you're working with isn't related in any way to the project of the Mormon Church, it is. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is that we should think about the industrial context, the technological industrial context in which we're doing our research, and which motivates us in some ways. This idea of being spread out around the world, that somehow we can come together in some kind of community through this research, is true. I mean, those motivations are strong. But again, there are other motivations. So MyHeritage is an interesting company, and I would think that many of you have used the MyHeritage databases. Now their latest trick of animating old family photographs, I think is an extraordinary feat of technological creepiness. I don't know how many of you have seen it and what you think about it, but that would be an interesting thing to think about as well. Why we want to see an ancestor smile, a technologically induced smile from an ancestor's photograph. Again, it plays on our desire to know these people, but to know them really as part of who we are, as part of our own story. It was the chief scientific officer at myheritage.com. There's a guy named Janov Ehrlich, who's also a computer scientist. He's a professor of computer science at Columbia University. And Janov Ehrlich in 2017 published an astonishing study in which he said that 60% of European of Americans of European descent, 60% could be identified from the information that had been uploaded to GEDCOM. Now, I don't know how many of you know what GEDCOM is. So what was so interesting about this was that this was somebody who worked in the genealogy industry, who still does, who works for MyHeritage, who runs essentially the computing, the databases for MyHeritage, who raised the alarm about privacy. I'll put his name in the chat. Janov Ehrlich. I think that's the spelling. And Lorraine, I'll come back to your question. You can ask me that question again after I finished. I'll just talk for another 10 minutes or so, and then we can open up the discussion. So Janef Ehrlich said, look, you know, people, because people are so motivated to make these to broaden our relationships, and genetic genealogy is allowing us to do that in ways that have never been possible before. But the commercial companies realized early on that they needed some privacy protection for genetic information. It's the most precious of our, you know, our bioinformation is absolutely precious to us. It's the most individual information that we have, and it connects us more, you know, most broadly to other people. And they recognized that they needed privacy provisions, and there's no genetic privacy. There's very little genetic privacy law in the US when it comes to commercial companies. There are very strict genetic privacy laws when it comes to university research, but not private databases, which seems contradictory, but that's the way it is. Right. So Janef said, so in order to get around those privacy restrictions, lots of people, and to make more connections, lots of people uploaded their DNA to GEDCOM. And I don't know how many of you have done that. Because GEDCOM had fewer privacy restrictions. So again, right at the beginning of my talk, I said that, you know, genealogy and privacy are kind of antithetical to each other. You know, Gary Mokotov makes this point that you know, government records should be free to anybody who wants to use them. But there are all kinds of privacy provisions with government records. But with genetic information, it's really, in some ways, it's up to us, because it's not a particularly well protected area, because it's so new and because it took off so quickly, particularly direct to consumer genetics. GEDmatch, GEDCOM, yeah. Sorry, GEDmatch. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. Thank you for that. So people got around those privacy restrictions by uploading their DNA results, not the DNA itself, but the DNA results that they had received from 23andMe or Ancestry or MyHeritage. And in the process, and that was the database that Janef Ehrlich looked at in terms of, would it be possible to identify people from the DNA information that they had uploaded in that database? And he said, yes, absolutely. You could identify 60% of the US population of European descent just by using the genetic information in that database. And he recommended a whole set of privacy rules that, of course, haven't been implemented. So I found it, you know, I thought he was one of the most interesting people who was working in that sphere, or in this sphere, because he was looking at both sides of the issue. On the one hand, working for MyHeritage, was completely invested in making, you know, in having a successful genealogical database. On the other hand, intensely concerned about the privacy issues. If you followed the GEDmatch story at all, you'll know that GEDmatch is the database that was mined unknowingly by police to track down the Golden State Killer. That was the database they went to, because there were no privacy provisions. They uploaded a false they uploaded the DNA profile, under a false profile, and then did a lot of very intense genealogical tree work to find a couple of possibilities. Now the floodgates opened on using that information, that database, for a purpose that nobody had anticipated. No genealogist had ever anticipated that their information would be used for police work. Now, again, we can talk about what's the greater good, catching, finally solving cold cases and the relief that brings to families, or again, privacy concerns. And was this information ever intended to be used that way? The founders of GEDmatch were completely overwhelmed by the privacy firestorm that was started by the police use of that database. And so then they sold the database. And who did they sell it to? Well, they sold it to a company called Veragen. What does Veragen do? Veragen is a company that, it originally was a company that produced the genetic processing, both the machines plus the technology. So genetic processing, DNA processing technologies for the police. So GEDmatch is now owned by a company that works for the police. That's the long and the short of it. So just to kind of wrap up my rapid-paced argument here, the major companies, the major databases, the Mormon database, obviously accumulating the information for religious purposes. Ancestry is selling the information to the pharmaceutical industry. That's where they're making most of their money. 23andMe is working with Google. 23andMe works with Calico, which is a Google-owned company. What's Calico's edge? Well, or Calico's investment? Well, Calico wants all of that information for longevity research. And we might say that's a wonderful thing. But what they're really trying to do is defy death. It's interesting, but that's what they're up to. So MyHeritage, I think MyHeritage is sort of more above board than some of the other companies. But every company has its own motive. Every database has its own motive for enticing us to give them their to give them our information. So I think it's worth thinking about what we do with the information that we amass, who we give it to, how we're motivated, why we're motivated to do what we do, and whether we should have some concerns about privacy, particularly genetic privacy. The one, and I'll end on this, canary in the coal mine story. But Iceland, to go back to Iceland, which has, as I said, the most comprehensive genetic and genealogical, those two databases braided database in the world. It was developed by a private company called Decode Genetics. Again, for really, health-saving purposes, looking for the genetic markers of inherited disease. The only problem is that Decode went bankrupt in 2008. And the most valuable part of their company was the database. And so they sold that database to an American company called Amgen, And then Amgen only had use for sort of half of the database. And so they sold that database on to a Chinese company that now owns, again, one of the largest private genealogical databases in the world. So we have no control. Once we send off our DNA, send off our information, once we send that information off, we have, irregardless of the privacy provisions of any particular database, we have no control of where that information might go next. And we cannot anticipate where that information might go next. So there's another side to genealogy, and particularly genetic genealogy that is worth talking about, and that's really all I want to say in this talk, is that it's worth thinking about, it's worth talking about, it's worth thinking about how that information circulates and who circulates it. All right, I will stop there and field your questions, which I'm sure will be pointed. And thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for being so brave to come to talk to what's probably not going to be the most welcoming audience. Can I first of all say to everybody on Facebook that if you have any questions, just type them in, and we can put them to Julia. Can I first of all just ask a question?
Sure.
Isn't this just where we are at the moment? That's to say, we have moved into this world of big data. It's not really so much a sort of genealogical issue, but Google and Facebook and everybody has so much information that it's almost the only people who can possibly affect it, or perhaps the only organization that can possibly change it, is the government of the United States, which is probably not very interested, because it itself has an interest in this data. That's to say, are we just living in this new world and there's nothing we can do about it?
To a certain extent, that's true. Absolutely. And lots of people just sort of throw up their hands and say, well, what's the point being worried about it? It's, what's the metaphor? The horse has already left the barn. The US, it's interesting what's happening in the US, because the federal government has been so slow to legislate genetic privacy in any way. The companies have been legislating themselves because they realized that consumers were increasingly concerned about privacy. And there were all kinds of, there have been all kinds of privacy breaches in the databases as well. MyHeritage had a huge privacy breach. 23andMe had a privacy breach. Ancestry. I mean, all of the databases have been hacked to one degree or another. So what's happening is that the legislation is happening at a state level, and individual states are introducing legislation that restricts access to genetic information. Maryland is trying to introduce legislation to prevent police from using the databases. So it's happening at a state level, and I think, but it's very much patchwork. Now the provisions in Europe are much stronger because of the GDPR. So the databases, I mean, this is why, Facebook moved out of Ireland, because the privacy provisions of the GDPR mean that if you're in Europe, or if a database in the US is using or has customers, European customers, they have to comply with GDPR rules. So that's changed the landscape a lot. in terms of privacy rules. But again, only for Europeans, not for North Americans, and the databases are primarily in North America.
Yeah. Bernard, you have a question. Let me unmute.
Thank you. Julia, thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm going to ask a question, but I'll preface it by saying, back in the 80s, I was really interested in computers and the world of computers. In the early 90s, I lived in Canada for more than a decade, and I used to subscribe regularly to a magazine called Covert Action. And I would read how the American government was funding the world's largest private computer installation in mountains in Salt Lake City, owned by the Mormons. IBM, various American presidents had expressed interest. This was long before we got into consumer genealogy and consumer DNA. But at no point did I ever think, since computers have been on the scene, that my data was safe, that I could have any control over it, that no matter what kind of legislation governments claimed to be passing, that there would not be backdoors either allowed by the governments, as happens so often, or by simply them working around the systems. So I don't feel that anything I do online is private, is protected. Do you have any suggestions as to how we go about it? I have been persuaded, for health reasons, to go for whole genome sequencing, because I've got a whole series of rare health conditions. I know that my data is not going to be private to me. So where do I go? What do I do? If I want to take advantage of that, I know that if I go through government routes, it's not going to be private.
There, I don't know every database that's out there by any means, or every tester that's out there. I mean, it's a huge industry in the direct consumer genetic testing. But there are databases. So if you use something like 23andMe to do that kind of testing, and I don't know if 23andMe is doing whole genome testing yet. I don't think so. I think they just do. I think what the government did with 23andMe, they were shut down by the US government because they were giving medical information to consumers. So the deal they cut was that they had to give a very limited amount of information. I think you have to go to a company that explicitly says, we will not sell your information. And I know there are companies out there.
They say it.
They say it, but if it's explicit in the contract that they will not sell your information, that they do not sell your information, then I think you can trust it. But you have to read the fine print. And if you go to the privacy, the terms and conditions, if you start to read the fine print of any of these companies, first of all, the contracts are 20 pages long. The terms and conditions and privacy condition or privacy policies sometimes contradict each other. They, say, wait a minute, I'm protected, but no, over here it says that you own proprietary rights. I own my rights to my own information, but you own it and you have a right to sell it. It gets very complicated. Gail Robinson is suggesting Nebula Genomics.
That's who I've gone with. But they're doing their testing using a Chinese database. So, where do you go with that?
I guess the question in some ways that I would ask And again, it's kind of a controversial question, is this is information we have never needed before. We have never needed to know our genetic relatives until the last 5 years. We have not needed, we've certainly needed some genetic health information, and certainly adoptees in particular have really wanted to find their genetic family so that they'll have some of that information. But beyond a couple of generations, by and large, we haven't needed that much genetic health information. So are we in some ways being sold an idea that we need way more information about ourselves than we've ever needed in the past? And again, the health industry, the genealogy industry motivates us to give motivates us to give them our DNA along those lines. Part of it's fear, part of it's promise, part of it's, so it's, Bernard, I know it's enticing. And certainly in terms of longevity, the idea that there are these databases out there that can predict, what kinds of diseases are higher risk for disease, or what kind of measures we might take to help mitigate genetic proclivities towards certain diseases. I mean, this is enticing information.
Can I just come back very quickly on that and say, I was advised, I'm a member of something called Rare Disease UK, and they've had some remarkable breakthroughs for people with rare diseases. And they're trying to encourage everybody who's got an undiagnosed or difficult to diagnose condition to go down the path of whole genome testing, which is why I did it. But I mean, I'm also interested in the genealogical side, but that is secondary for me. But even so, the same privacy and what happens to the data issues arise. But thank you, I won't take any more of your time.
That's all right. Thank you for your question, Bernard.
Thank you, Bernard. Raquel Levy Toledano is one of the people who's leading Sephardic DNA project. So it'll be quite interesting to hear from her.
Yes.
Raquel, I think you're unmuted.
Yes. Thank you for your very interesting talk. What I'd like to say is that we should not generalize about databases. Actually, we manage a database on Avotenu, and you were saying lately that there are some information that we don't need, but we have access to it now, and we didn't have this kind of information before this technology arose. And today, especially at Avotenu, we have a project that is, I would say, a scientific project even, by identifying who are the ancestors of the Jewish people. What I'd like to say is it is fully anonymous, that only a full hand of people have access to this data, that is not sold to anyone, that is, we pay, I mean, we get donation to pay for the test when we pay these people. We don't have any political agenda, and the whole thing is just research and trying to identify. When you are saying who we are the results of our roots and ancestors. I don't think that we are lost when we get all these information, genetic information, genealogical information. So I wanted to clarify this point.
It's amazing technology, but it is redefining who we think we are. If being Jewish historically has been a process of identifying with cultural tradition, knowing perhaps 2 or 3 generations of ancestors, studying the Torah. I mean, if you think about what has constituted being Jewish historically, yes, genealogy has been part of it, particularly the genealogies of the rabbinical lines, no question. But we've never needed that kind of genetic we've never needed to define those genetic relationships. Let's put it that way. It was enough. If you knew your mother was Jewish, your grandmother was Jewish, that was the genetic inheritance. So it's an amazing scientific project, yes, but it is a new way of understanding what constitutes being Jewish, what constitutes relatives. Now, the dangerous side of it is that we turn being Jewish into something genetic. And Israel has floated the idea of a couple of times of doing genetic tests on people who would like to return to Israel. And if you don't have the genetics, then sorry, you're out of luck, even if you are, you have a strong cultural tradition. We should be so wary of that idea, so wary. The history of eugenics and the history of genealogy was how the Holocaust happened. We, above all, should be concerned about how that information will be used. I have no doubt that you have taken all of the privacy provisions possible for your database. Anonymous can be, unless it's truly anonymous, but of course it isn't, because you're using the genetic information with the genealogical information, because without those two together, neither is as useful. Sorry, Raquel.
Yes, actually we are studying the Y chromosome, and
right.
The Y chromosome is that cannot identify an individual. It identifies a lineage. That's the first point. Secondly, we are not categorizing people as Jew or non-Jew.
Okay.
That's not our goal. Our goal is really to understand who were our ancestors 2,000 years ago. So, of course, from that time to today, what we are looking at is only their Y chromosome that has been transmitted from that ancestor to a male descendant from the patrilineal line, which means that it's probably one ancestor out of 100,000. So that's not a way to define a Jew for sure.
Mm. And it's interesting that the first database in the States, the first genetic genealogy database in the States, started with a Y chromosome study. Edward Greenspan, was it Greenspan? Greenspan, I think.
Bennett Greenspan.
Yes.
Yeah, Bennett Greenspan. Thank you. That was the original project. Was a Y chromosome.
And actually, we are doing these projects with family tree DNA, which was funded by Greenspan.
But that database has been sold, or that database is also being.
We study only the Y chromosome, not. And when people ask us to do the autosomal DNA, then we test it for them. But that's at their request.
Yeah.
And actually, as a bonus for participating to the study. So when they request it, we do it as well.
But that's a very contained study, and I understand that. And there have been lots of Y chromosome studies, and there've been, there's so much interesting research published particularly out of Israel on Y chromosome studies, and it's a fascinating scientific project, no question. And I'm not saying don't do it. but it sounds like the study you're doing is very contained. You've been very clear about how much information you're gathering. You've been very clear about privacy. So you've been aware. You were aware from the beginning about all of these issues. And that's a wonderful thing. But, you know, Grinspoon's database was developed explicitly on a for-profit model. It was a proof of concept that went immediately to a profit model. So it's, again, you know, I'm speaking very broadly about the history of the for-profit industry, which has gobbled up. It has gobbled up all of the grassroots databases. That's how the industry worked. You know, Roots Web, which is where so many genealogies started, which was a community-based exchange, was gobbled up and privatized by Ancestry. So the history of these databases as well has been the same thing for so the Sorensen Genetics database, which was a nonprofit scientific project. Well, lo and behold, Ancestry bought it, and all of a sudden, all of those people who contributed their information no longer had access to it. So the history of these databases, as grassroots as they have been in the beginning, has been that they have been, at a certain point, they couldn't maintain, they didn't have the finances to maintain the databases, and they were bought. And
can I, sorry to interrupt, but Shelley Talale Dadashi sort of knows more or less everybody. I'd just be interested to hear what her opinion is.
Thank you. It was a really interesting talk. I really appreciate your opinions on this. I think the main thing, and this is one of the times that I really wish Adam Brown was here and talk about projects. One of the first really, well, yeah, I would assume so, yeah, because we're from 2007. And Family Tree DNA has been around since 2000. But one of the projects we had established there with my co-founder, Judy Lefkowitz-Simon, and myself, was the Iberian Ashkenaz project at Family Tree DNA, which has now been folded into the Alvateno Jewish Heritage Program. It was extremely successful, and we still have many people joining it. It started out as a Y-DNA project, but that's a whole different thing. But I think one of the first questions when we talk about privacy, and I don't think there's anybody on here that's on the Zoom or on the Facebook viewing that doesn't understand that the minute you get on Facebook, all semblance of privacy has literally gone out the window. Once you're on Facebook, forget about any kind of privacy, let alone genetic or genealogical or anything else. But I think we all know that by now. But I think, yes, each company has a different way of handling their DNA and genetic matter, that's for sure. Some of the companies, like MyHeritage, actually say on the bottom, we do not sell or give your genetic information or DNA. It's very blatant, it's right out there. Disclaimer, I am the US genealogy advisor for MyHeritage, but it does say that on every page when you're talking about DNA. Other companies have different policies. But as Bernard was talking about the rare diseases thing, this is just such the progress that genetic genealogy, that DNA and genetics have produced in the past 10 years. And we all know DNA began with Family Tree DNA in the year 2000. They were the first consumer DNA company. But the progress that has been made over this more than a decade, and particularly in the past 10 years, whether it devolves into rare disease research or it devolves into justice, finding criminals. I think it's always a problem of the privacy of the individual versus giving up a little bit of privacy for the greater good. And this, I think, is an entirely different program that you'll have to do 2 hours on. And I understand what Julia's talking about. I understand the privacy issues, of course. There's just been a huge conversation in that been in a couple of the genealogy groups on Facebook about the privacy of the deceased. And really, there isn't any privacy for deceased individuals. The problem comes when you're linking to living individuals, and that's where the problem of privacy comes in. But this entire, the entire subject of privacy is not just limited. In our talk, it's limited to DNA and genealogy, of course, but this is the entire concept of privacy overall using the internet. But on the other hand, if we didn't have the internet, just look at the genealogical resources that are available to anyone with a computer and a connection that we didn't have 10 or 15 years ago, and particularly in the fields of Sephardic research, because there was no way to get to these archives, even when we could travel. And now all you need is a computer and an internet connection. You could do it from your cell phone practically. So it's a much wider concept of privacy overall, perhaps, that we need to be concerned about. Or on the other hand, we don't, because we know the minute you get online, you've lost all semblance of privacy as well. But I think for everyone, I wrote that in the notes, of course, for every company, there is a very particular list of terms and conditions. There are opt-ins and opt-outs for a whole host of items on each of these sites. And people that are really concerned about privacy for genealogical information or genetic information need to investigate where they've tested. Are your opt-ins and opt-outs checked off or not? And it's something that people have to be proactive about if they're concerned about it. And I mean, I've seen it in the genealogy groups on Facebook. People say, what the heck? It's all out there anyway. So it doesn't matter if X as an individual checks a box or doesn't check a box. Somebody's going to get it somehow anyway. But
yeah, but I mean, I think that kind of, that almost like defeatist.
well, yeah.
You know, the problem with genetic information is that it's not just your information. If you put your genetic information into a database, it's your entire family as well. And so people think about, well, it's only my information, so I'm making this decision for myself and I don't care. But maybe your children will care, maybe your parents will care, maybe your brothers and sisters will care. And that, I think, is a real problem, is that people don't consider the privacy of all the people that they're genetically connected to.
So what is your suggestion?
Don't do it. Or don't do it with the major companies. Or do it with a company that has
Julia, but doesn't it
privacy?
But doesn't it depend on what you want? If you're looking for unknown relatives, you can't use a smaller company because you don't do matching.
This is where I really get, you know, become, you know, the devil's advocate. How many relatives do you need? Let me ask you that question. How many relatives could you actually, live ones, never mind the dead ones.
No.
The dead ones are better because you don't actually have to.
I actually prefer the dead ones because they don't talk back.
Exactly.
But I have 2 extremely rare names that I am researching. If it wasn't for DNA, we would not be finding the people that I'm finding, because they are so rare. And there have been name changes, but everyone knows the original name. I mean, I found our entire branches in Bombay. I found branches in South America. No one would ever have known about it. I mean,
It's
the concept
a
of,
completely enticing project.
Yeah.
I don't have any, but surely you recognize that it's a passion project. It is not something that is constitutive necessarily of who you are, right? So then the trade-off is that you're distributing that information far and wide. That's really only the argument I'm making, is that we get so enthusiastic about the project, so compelling, that nothing stands in the way.
but it's again, no, but you're raising correct questions that I think people need to think about for their own purposes, for sure. But the whole issue of privacy is much wider than just DNA and genealogy.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's a big piece of it because the biggest private genetic data databases in the world are genealogical. That's where they've come from. So that it's incumbent on us, I think, to think about it.
Thank you. Pauline, you've unmuted yourself. Do you have a question?
No,
Okay, no worries.
that was an accident too.
No worries. Thank you. Does anybody else have a question that they want to put? We've already.
I saw an interesting question in the chat. Why are the National Archives of the United States selling their information to Ancestry, which then puts it online for a fee?
Because all of the archives in Canada and in the US are underfunded. And so they are selling the only resource they have, which are the records. And what that means is that government archives, municipal, federal, whatever, then don't have to provide public access. If they can say, look, you can go to Ancestry and find the information there. We don't need to maintain, the physical space for people to come to our archives or the archivists. We don't have to do that kind of public work if you can just go to Ancestry. So that's what's going on, is they're just underfunded. And so it's an easy way to fund themselves is to sell off digital access.
I feel privileged to live in Holland. And the law says that any information that's put in the archives becomes freely available for everyone to look at, with exceptions like living persons or state secrets and the like. But the rest is there. Either you can go to them or you can find a lot of information online.
But I would assume that the Dutch government is also funding the archive to digitize their records.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the difference. That's not happening in the US. They're cutting funding to archival institutions. I think Maureen Berger has a question.
Yeah, hi.
I have a question.
Hi, everybody. The point is, I think, it's a hobby for us, it's an interest for us, but it is a business for some of them, and we do have to bear that in mind. We have to be a little bit careful.
That's beautifully succinct. That's the argument, Doreen. Thank you. You see, I could have just not yammered on for the last hour.
That's my opinion.
Edward, sorry, you have something.
Yes. Hello. Yeah. I have a question. I mean, I know that the importance of the privacy, and all stuff, but I think it's maybe the most important things, at least for Sephardic or Ashkenazi Jews is about the health. I mean, I know that there is a lot of diseases that we have to investigate about that, like muscular dystrophy plus dementia. I mean, there is a lot of people, I mean, appears to be that because they became married in between relatives, okay, for many generations. And this is the important thing, just to investigate. So there is any source that investigate these kind of things about the diseases. This is very important because this is the future. This is the future for new generations. So this is my question. I mean, there is institutions who are serious about investigation as it's not for profit. You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, those would be university researchers.
Exactly.
And that's the difference, is that if you conduct, go back to Iceland for a minute, Kari Stephenson, the founder of Decode Genetics, was a geneticist at Harvard, and he didn't like the constraints that were put on him as a university researcher, which is why he went to Iceland to start Decode, was so that he could get around those constraints. So if, the kind of research that you can do in a university, which is where a lot of that research is also funded by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, there's really sort of no space that isn't compromised in some way. But university funded research tends to be much more constrained, both in terms of privacy and impact on the subjects who work with those studies. And the research, once it's published, is public information. Well, you have to have access to the publishing, it's to the university or so to academic databases. But so there's a difference in research that's conducted by the pharmaceutical industry and university research, although there's often some overlap.
Do you have any names?
No.
Any name? Sorry. I mean, that you can recommend, or?
No, I don't do that kind of fine, detailed research about who's doing what in terms of health. It's just there's so much out there. That would be a whole other career.
Because there is no doubt that it's a DNA related, right? So.
Yes, okay, of course. And the DNA is useful for medical research, no question, no question. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that. What I'm saying is that the for-profit spaces in which that's happening are not being very upfront about how they're using your information. So the genetic genealogy databases are not being very upfront about who their research partners are and how those research partners are using that information. That's my argument. Not that the research shouldn't happen, but I think that there should be more privacy provisions about how that information is used and by whom and for what.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
And I think you've got some useful suggestions here in the chat about places that you can look at. Thank you for that, David. Yeah.
So, Ton, we've been talking an hour and a half.
Yes.
Once we get going, it's hard to stop.
Can I just say thank you and just comment because some of the people here are not our regular crowd, that we thought this was a really important subject to look at, the issue about privacy and the whole industry that is surrounding genealogy, which I think we all need to just think about what we want to do. I'm afraid I'm that person that put all of my genetic information immediately online, but others might take other positions. And can I, Adam Brown, who is quite outspoken on the subject, couldn't join us. He's presenting somewhere else. Can I just give a plug for Avatenu DNA, which, as was discussed, is a Y DNA project. I've participated in it. My own Y DNA is probably sort of Portuguese goat herd rather than, from the Temple of Solomon. I'm a member of a Sephardic congregation. It makes no difference to me. But what is happening with that project and other projects is we're just unraveling a whole history that we wouldn't otherwise have. And I personally love that work, but at the same time also, I've shared photographs of close relatives online and then suddenly seen them popping up elsewhere. So there are issues there. Ton, do you wish to sum up or?
Yes. And everyone is welcome to look at Julia Creet's website, juliacreet.com, for more information on the subject and to look at her documentaries and maybe her books. Thank you very much, Julia, for giving a very interesting talk and giving us food for thought. Thanks everyone for watching. Special thanks to our patrons who make this possible by giving generously. And we hope to see you all next week when we will interview Shelley Dashati about the history of genealogy online.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me and for all of you for listening. And if you go to my website, you can see links to the docs, my book, the Genealogical Sublime. If you really, it's just a history of the databases. It's an expansion of the doc. And again, thanks so much for the questions.
Thank you. Julia, I will send you an invitation just to come back in 5 minutes just for a quick chat.
All right. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week.
See you.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hej då.